Gato Roboto is a game about a cute little kitty piloting a very dangerous mech who isn't afraid of anything. The game was developed by Soft, who also made Devolver Bootleg, but I wouldn't be surprised if most people didn't know that, seeing as how Googling the developers just leads to articles and blog posts about Gato Roboto. I wasn't really sure what to expect when I played the game. It's available on Xbox Game Pass, and I used the Surprise Me option to pick a game, and that was the first one it landed on. The game itself is a Metroidvania, splitting into 3 gameplay types. You play as the cat, and the mech, or the gameplay equivalent of what it's like to be a deer on ice. Let's try to start from the top here. Skip to this time on screen or in the description if you don't want to be spoiled. The plot starts with a captain named Gary flying a spaceship on his patrol route, about to respond to a distress signal from an abandoned planet. Before he can properly land, Kiki, the cat we play as, crashes the ship like a dumbass, leaving Gary injured and unable to leave the ship as we explore the planet and try to find out who sent the signal, why, and hopefully get some help as well. As the game goes along, Kiki meets lots of characters, most notably a mouse who just really wants to kill you, which he'll probably do. As you play the game, you find out that this mouse is actually housing the brain of a scientist named Otto, one of the last few intelligent life forms on the planet, and you find out that among everything he was doing research on, one of them was transferring life between organisms to help them escape death and live longer. One day, Otto got a guard dog from the security personnel who was deathly ill, and he named it Barkley. Barkley was the only creature there who was nice to Otto, and him being so close to death made him more and more deranged. It reached its peak when the security personnel found out he was funneling money from other projects into taking care of Barkley, and they tried to arrest him, in which Otto unleashed his security robots and either killed or captured the security and other workers, transferring their conscience into the creatures you fight in the game. In the final confrontation with Otto, he exchanges bodies with Gary, and after you beat him, just as he's about to swap your body with Barkley's, Barkley himself escapes the tube that was keeping him alive. Since he didn't recognize Otto in Gary's body, he attacks him and lands the final blow, allowing Kiki and Barkley to escape. Despite the huge story dump I just gave you, I left out several details and the story is never actually told to you in a forceful or linear fashion, save for the end of the game. There are computer logs with videos inside them that you can find that fill in a lot of the gaps about the story, like the frog that gives Kiki upgrades for cassette tapes is someone that was turned into a frog by the professor, given that she sneezes a lot, and Otto talks about one of his assistants being allergic to amphibious creatures. Some of the highlights when it comes to dialogue are the interactions Gary has with Kiki and Otto, especially this note Gary leaves for Kiki near the end of the game. Like I said before, the gameplay is split into 3 different parts: Naked Kiki, Solid Kiki, and Liquid Kiki. Naked Kiki is pretty fun to control, and probably the most fun I had with the game until the mech started getting significant upgrades. Kiki can repeatedly jump up walls to climb them. She's initially much faster than Solid Kiki and easier to control, making it easy to dodge and weave past enemies. The trade-off for this is that Naked Kiki has no attacks and dies in one hit, which makes avoiding enemies in Naked Kiki sections feel great, but sometimes they can feel a bit cheap, but not enough to make me outright hate those segments, especially since funny stuff like this can happen. Solid Kiki gameplay can feel a bit slow and clunky at first, since you're limited to a dinky little pea shooter that you might as well ignore in favor of the much more useful and versatile rocket shortly after. The rocket deals double damage with the pea shooter, goes across the entire screen as opposed to only a third of it, can break crumbling rocks, and can be useful for more precision platforming. The only drawback is that you can only fire 2 rockets in a row before it overheats. but if you time it just right, you can usually shoot out 3 since it runs on a timer, rather than a set shot limit. The rockets can be combined with another upgrade, the spin jump, in order to unlock the true fun of the game. This game prides itself on its mobility, something the trailer seems keen to let you know about. This game is just fun to control and run around in after getting the spin jump. Just doing it in normal scenarios where it isn't needed is fun, since the weight and momentum it gives Solid Kiki are so satisfying. It also damages enemies when you hit them, allowing you to chain jumps over gaps or groups of enemies, skipping some rooms entirely if you don't feel like engaging in combat. The only times when combat is necessary are in rooms that feel like they're just there to pad out the game. They lock you in and make you fight a horde of simple enemies rather than letting you optionally skip them. I understand why they did this, to keep players on their toes and not allow them to skip every combat scenario. Most of these rooms stay empty after you clear them. It's understandable why they did this in the final area, since it's so heavily focused on combat and you're not going to be exploring all rooms anyways, but having so many littered through the game feels like a waste. If the ones meant for gatekeeping collectibles were the only ones here, I'd be a lot less harsh on them. If I had to say there was one thing wrong with the spin jump, it's that it cancels out after you jump on an enemy, which means you have to manually press the button again in order to keep the chain going. It's pretty unintuitive and hard to manage, especially since bouncing off an enemy can cause you to fly off pretty far. Having to focus on lining up the next jump and making sure the spin jump starts again is a bit of a pain. The next upgrade is the dash, which is pretty useless except in certain scenarios in the area in which it's a pain. Due to the spin jump allowing jumps to be chained, you can pretty much just hop over everything standing in your way, but the dash becomes useful when, if you obtain all 14 cassettes, you get the hopper upgrade, which allows you to chain spin jumps all on your own after dashing, and even makes landing spin jumps on enemies deal more damage, as much as a rocket blast would. More on cassettes later. The next upgrade is a rocket one, which allows Solid Kiki to shoot one more rocket, which is honestly a bit disappointing, but I'm not torn up over it. Afterwards is the Big Shot upgrade, which allows regular shots to deal more damage, fly farther, and hit a bigger area due to their increased size. Combined with the Repeater, the first upgrade you get from the Frog Assistant, it makes the starting weapon actually useful. The last upgrade Solid Kiki gets is a Decoder, or at least it's classified as one despite not having any gameplay use. The final part of gameplay is Liquid Kiki, and it's easily the worst part of the game. I understand Naked Kiki not getting any upgrades, but this part doesn't make any sense. Sure, it has significantly less playtime compared to Solid Kiki, but I don't think a damage or health upgrade would have been too much to ask for, or at least the ability to face in more than 2 directions. Liquid Kiki can only face in the direction she's shooting, with bullets that are about as powerful as the starting gun with no alternative. Not only does this make it annoying to hit enemies, but it's annoying to try and dodge enemies in their attacks as well. Liquid Kiki drags through the water like a hunk of iron along the pavement, and all of this culminates in the only time I didn't have fun playing this game. Luckily it's fairly short and doesn't bring down the rest of the game. I suppose there is one final gameplay type, but it's only useful for one boss fight and some mini puzzles. I'll call this one Venom Kiki. It's just Kiki firing a single shot explosive from a turret that needs to be charged up beforehand. I would have liked to see more creative use out of it other than shooting rocks in an admittedly fun boss fight, but it's not something worth complaining about. The game has a fairly manageable difficulty, only really dipping into anything truly difficult during the boss fights, at least upon the first playthrough. The platforming segments where you fight regular enemies are fairly simple, with some bullet sponge enemies thrown in there that kinda just slow down the pace, especially in rooms where fighting enemies is required. Some enemies can take up to 4 missiles before they go down, which feels like a bit much, especially when surrounded with other enemies that usually go down in 1 or 2. Again, this isn't as much of a problem in the final area, when rooms are dedicated to fighting these tankier enemies, and you have fully upgraded weapons, but making enemies take so many hits to defeat in the second area of the game feels a bit like overkill. Other than that, they're fairly easy to manage and take out if you just stay aware of your surroundings, which is hard to do sometimes given how many enemies the game can throw at you at once. Nothing impossible or unfair, thankfully, but something that did bother me was how enemies would always respawn whenever you exited and entered a room. There were several times in the game where shooting a rocket would push me back into a room I was just in, respawning enemies I just killed for no reason. Since the room sizes can vary so much, it's extremely jarring, and I wish enemy respawning happened when you left an area and came back. The platforming where you spin jump off of mines to jump across a gap is tricky but satisfying, but it's annoying to fall into the pit of enemies after failing, and having it happen over and over again. These enemies can barely even do anything to you aside from the easy to kill frogs, so I don't understand why they're here other than to be a nuisance. The enemies themselves are pretty fun, with lots of varieties between them and the game finding fun ways to make them more interesting, or just throwing so many new ideas at you that you can't really say you're bored. The pinnacle of difficulty in this game is, as I said before, the boss fights, which are either with the mouse finding new ways to try and kill you or one of his creations doing so. The aqueducts and heater core have mini-bosses in them, both for each area being the same boss but slightly different from one another. The aqueducts have turrets that have two attacks, one that shoots bullets that you can't destroy but have to dodge, and the other launching rockets that you can destroy but they seek you automatically. There isn't much to say about them other than that. The heater core mini-bosses actually make larger leaps to diversify from one another, giving them character as two brothers who get some good lines in, the first one saying how his brother will avenge his death, and the brother mourning his death and saying how he never got to grow a mustache before fighting you. This isn't all they do to diversify, as the second one has several more hazards to look out for and is trickier with his attack patterns. It isn't much of a huge difference, but this is much better than how the turrets were handled. The only bosses besides this are the area bosses, which are fighting the mouse over and over again, but each fight is fresh and unique, pushing your knowledge of everything you've learned leading up to it. Some of them are great, like the ventilation boss fight where you essentially have to do a perfect run due to having to play as Naked and Venom Kiki, but due to the brevity of it, death doesn't feel like a penalty, and it doesn't take long to get back to the point where you died at. The only boss fight I ended up not enjoying was the one where you played as Liquid Kiki. It's a bullet hell where you don't have the chance to actually dodge the bullets due to the sluggish controls, and the amount of damage you do is so pitiful it makes the fight drag on for much longer than it has any right to. Losing a boss fight isn't that big of a punishment, since save rooms are right outside of them, but pre-battle dialogue plays every single time you rematch a boss, which is something I wish wasn't there. I had enough courtesy to take it out for the final boss, so I don't know why they didn't have the foresight to do that with other bosses. It's easy to spam through, but it causes the screen to flash like crazy, to the point where having to rematch a boss gave me a headache. As for the levels themselves, they're extremely well put together and memorable, despite the simplistic graphics. The landing site functions as a level, but is fairly forgettable. On my second playthrough, it was the only one where I had to constantly look at the map in order to find out where I was going, something I only had to do once or twice for the other levels. The music does a much better job establishing the tone of the area, with this one specifically having several different ones that change as the story progresses. The song that plays before you play a solid Kiki is slow and creepy, which perfectly captures the hesitation one would have exploring an alien planet, with the music going the extra mile to sound just a bit off itself, as if it's telling you personally that something isn't right here. After getting solid Kiki, the music becomes less paranoid but still has an uneasy edge to it, letting you know that you need to stay on your toes and be prepared. The final theme that plays when you revisit right before the climax of the game is completely different, capturing the frantic feeling the player has as they rush to their objective. The next area, the Nexus, is much more memorable in layout, as pretty much no screen goes to waste, having something to help it stand out. It's also the hub of the game, so it'll be fairly easy to remember compared to most other parts of the game with how often you go in and out of it. The song played here has a very relaxed feeling to it, but it still has an uncertain edge, since enemies are still here that you need to look out for. The aqueducts carry on that unnerving sense of dread the other songs have, feeling much more aquatic and reverberated due to it being a water level. The level itself stands out fairly well, with any room that isn't flooded having leaky pipes and longer pipes aligning the walls with other metallic objects. Obstacle placement and liquid kiki portions seem a bit obtuse at first, being hard to navigate with these controls. But it comes together nicely when, after draining the aqueducts of all the flooding, they serve as platforms for you to test out the new spin jump, along with helpless enemies who just flop on the floor now being good practice for chaining spin jumps. The music also changes once everything is drained, becoming less aquatic and speeding up a bit more to match the new tone. The heater core immediately stands out with the effect of, well, heat being on the screen. Not only that, but pipes in this level are lined up with brick walls and fans on the ceiling, with steam constantly leaking from the pipes. The song for this area is oppressive, accompanied by what sounds like steam leaking from the pipes in the back. The theme for after you've cleared is much trippier, with any startup into a more intense song being almost instantly subdued. Unfortunately, the heater core doesn't change this drastically or nearly as interesting of a way as the aqueducts did. The biggest change is the removal of the lava pits, as they become destructible rocks now, but it doesn't change the dynamic the player has with the level like getting rid of the flood in the aqueducts did. The ventilation is a pure naked Kiki stage, with the majority of the rooms being small and cramped, barely having any room for Kiki to get past enemies or obstacles except at just the right moment. The theme for this area is catchy and constantly fades in and out as you enter and exit ventilation shafts, simulating what it would be like if the song was actually playing there. Unlike the two areas preceding it, this one doesn't have a new theme for you when you clean it out. But it goes through the least dramatic change compared to the other stages, so it makes sense. The Incubator is probably my favorite area in the game. Having the only natural life forms being the creatures and test tubes is unnerving, and shows just how far down the rabbit hole the villain has gone. It would make sense that this area would be the most densely populated with enemies you've seen before, as this is where they all came from. The theme is both unnerving and intense. The laboratory is devoid of anything living, the security bots being the main threats, but even after 2 playthroughs I can't recall a single room for this section off the top of my head. It lacks any real atmosphere compared to the other areas and is carried pretty hard by the music, which is a more threatening version of the Incubator theme. I get that it's a combat section and we're supposed to be rushing to the final fight, but something a bit more would have been appreciated. The game puts a lot into the sound design and music, and while I won't talk about it in detail here because it's much better to experience it while playing the game, that doesn't mean I won't give praise to it. The developers made every song have significance, with every unique room getting its own theme, and the songs changing to fit the shifts in levels and the changing tones in the story. There isn't a single song wasted in the entire soundtrack. Even the area bosses, which are fighting the same character but in different suits, have their own unique boss themes for each. The sound design is also worth praising, as just the act of shooting enemies is satisfying due to the noises they make, and the noises the mech makes. The act of just walking is fun, as the clunking of solid Kiki's feet is satisfying to listen to in a way I can't really describe. The visuals of the game are simple, and there are collectibles called cassettes that alter the look of the game. I never used them though. They all made the game look worse and just strained my eyes to look at. I don't know who keeps telling indie devs that people love the simulation of blood rushing to their eyes with the use of the Virtual Boy palettes, but I hope whoever that is goes bald before they turn 27. The game is fairly short, my first playthrough taking me about 4 hours, with my second one shaving an hour off. I've seen people who are actually good at video games beat it in even less time and still get 100%. I tried to do it, but I guess I'm blind and missed one thing, and I don't want to bother doing it again. I'd say that's a fair amount of content and quality for $8, but that's something you'd have to decide for yourself. Give Gato Roboto a try if you haven't, especially if you have Xbox Game Pass, which essentially means the game is free. Have a good one.